This morning we are in Ezekiel chapter 7, so if you'll get your Bibles and we will start there. I use the Enduring Word translation, and David Gusick is my main commentator. In verse 1 and 2 of chapter 7, moreover, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, And you, son of man, thus says the Lord God to the land of Israel. So the word of the Lord came to me, is what Ezekiel says. And this repetition of this phrase reminds us that Ezekiel was the prophet, and God gave him what he's supposed to say to the people. And yet at the time that he spoke this, Jerusalem had not yet been destroyed, and Judah had not yet been completely conquered. So this was a message to the land of Israel to announce their judgment upon them. In verse 3 and 4, the end has come upon the four corners of the land. Now the end has come upon you, and I will send my anger against you. I will judge you according to your ways, and I will repay you for all your abominations. My eye will not spare you, nor will I pity, that I will repay your ways, and your abominations will be in your midst. Then you shall know that I am the Lord. There is that phrase that's going to be repeated. Verse 3, prophetically, Ezekiel could see the end for the entire land of Israel. No place is going to be spared here, and there would remain no land under the control of the tribes of Israel. Their rebellion, their idolatry was over, and now the end has come upon you, it says. The time of patience from God was over, and there was to be no more waiting. And it was wise to consider the end before it actually gets there. We all ought to do that. Ezekiel hoped to bring this wisdom to a rebellious Israel. And God promised us to bring simple judgment to the people of Judah and Jerusalem. As a kingdom, their ways would determine their judgment, and the judgment would be severe. My eye will not spare you, nor will I have pity. So this great judgment had a good purpose, and it would be the way that God's people would return to a true relationship with him and their covenant with him. Verse 5 through 7, thus says the Lord God, a disaster, a singular disaster. Behold, it has come. An end has come, the end has come. It has dawned for you. Behold, it has come. Doom has come to you. You who dwell in the land, the time has come. A day of trouble is near, and not of rejoicing in the mountains. Verse 5, the future disaster brought by the Babylonian armies was revealed to Ezekiel. The short phrases were spoken as if they were in the mouth of someone watching, like they were watching what was actually going on and looking at the damage that was being done. So the time of Israel's rejoicing in the mountains over the pagan altars and the perverted worship is going to be over. The opportunity for recovery was past, and the nation had overstepped their boundaries of the forbearance and the waiting of God. He had had it. He's not going to wait any longer. Verse 8 and 9, now upon you I will soon pour out my fury and spend my anger upon you. I will judge you according to your ways, and I will repay you for all your abominations. My eye will not spare, nor will I have pity. I will repay you according to your ways, and your admonitions will be in your midst. Then you shall know that I am the Lord who strikes. In verse 8, as in other places, this word abomination mainly is a sense of terrible, even disgusting idolatry. So God's fury and his anger would come upon them because of this idolatry. Once again, ultimate restoration is what God has in mind. In verse 9, the severe judgment for their idolatry is going to show that their idols were powerless to save them. In destroying their reliance on idols, then they would come back to their true relationship with God. So the message closed by stunning the exiles with a new name for God, the Lord who strikes the blow, the one who would now judge Judah. In verse 10 through 13, behold the day, Behold, it has come. Doom has gone out. The rod has blossomed. Pride has budded. Violence has risen up into a rod of wickedness. None of them shall remain, none of their multitude, none of them, nor shall there be wailing for them. The time has come, the day draws near. Let not the buyer rejoice, nor the seller mourn, for wrath is on their whole multitude. For the seller shall not return to what has been sold, though he may still be alive. For the vision concerns the whole multitude, and it shall not turn back. No one will strengthen himself who lives in iniquity. In verse 10, in Ezekiel's time, there were many false prophets who told them that God was going to rescue them and send them back to Judah and Jerusalem. And these were lies, and it was hard to believe that the day of the great judgment is actually going to come, but it did. So Ezekiel tried to prepare them for this. The rod has blossomed, pride has budded. This is an interesting reference here to Aaron's rod that budded. That's in Numbers. That miraculous blossoming was a supernatural demonstration of God's favor and his approval of Moses and Aaron. The judgment is to come upon in Jerusalem, and it would also be a supernatural occurrence, but it would demonstrate God's anger and the pride of his disobedient people. In verse 11, the day of Jerusalem judgment would begin with the blossoming of the arrogant superpower, Babylon. God's judgment rod is what Babylon actually was. So the wickedness and the violent deeds of the citizens of Judah created the need for this rod of correction. In verse 12, Ezekiel reassured them that none would escape the coming calamity. Both the buyer and the seller would have reasons to mourn, for wrath is on their whole multitude. Buying and selling will have lost all their significance here in the face of the total disaster that's going to come upon the buyer and the seller alike. In verse 13, in imitation of the ancient laws of Jubilee, the prophet declares that the patrimonial property that had been lost to the family would not return to them. So the year of Jubilee is going to be canceled. That was always when, after 50 years, then everything that had been lost to them would be restored. Well, that's all going to be canceled. Most of the time in the scriptures, when God announces judgment, it is an implied invitation for repentance, whereupon God will relent from his announced judgment. That's the way it's happened all this time before. But with this prophecy of Ezekiel, this is not the case. The judgment is coming and it's not going to turn back. Ezekiel indicated the foolishness of the man who thought that he could strengthen himself in the very iniquity which called down the wrath of God. Hardening himself in sin would not accomplish immunity from punishment. It would actually make the punishment worse. Verse 14 through 18. They have blown the trumpet and made everyone ready, but no one goes to battle. For my wrath is on all their multitude. The sword is outside, and the pestilence and famine within. Whoever is in the field will die by the sword, and whoever is in the city, famine and pestilence will devour him. Those who survive will escape and be on the mountains like doves of the valleys, all of them mourning each for his iniquity. Every hand will be feeble, and every knee will be as weak as water. They will also be girded with sackcloth. Horror will cover them. Shame will be on every face, baldness on all their heads. In verse 14, there would be very little resistance to the coming Babylonian conquest. Our soldiers, it says, will fight bravely to save our land from the Babylonians. Well, Ezekiel told them that they wouldn't fight at all, much less bravely. And the first manifestation would be the paralysis of the people. They're going to be so afraid, so fearful, so that when the trumpet is blown for the battle and all is ready, not anyone is going to go forward. they're going to be overcome with terror and grief, and that included their army. Ezekiel methodically described the fate of those in the field, those in the city, and those who survive. Each would experience this coming calamity in their own way, but no one is going to escape it. So what the prophet seems to be envisioning here is the total destruction of the towns and the cities in Judah, forcing those who survive to seek refuge in the mountains. And it says the sound of their mourning will resemble the plaintive cooing of an ordinary pigeons. We had pigeons when I grew up, and they were in the top of the barn, coo, coo. And so it's going to be something like that, how they sound. They're going to be having that plaintive cooing. In verse 17, there's a vivid account of the panic that would follow the people here. In the RSV, it says, all knees are weak as water. And it actually means all knees run water. So this word is for the loss of bladder control. And it's in moments of terror. Sometimes when people get so frightened, they lose their bladder control. And this is what they're talking about. This is by Walter and Hoppe. However, the other translations have captured its sense, and they say all their knees will run with urine. The prophet is hereby referring to that loss of bladder control that occurs in a moment of extreme crises. When the calamity came, it would not be light. This was far beyond an inconvenience. In their own way, they're all going to share the horror and the shame. In verse 19 through 22, they will throw their silver in the streets, and their gold will be like refuse. Their silver and their gold will not be able to deliver them in the day of the wrath of the Lord. They will not satisfy their souls nor fill their stomachs, because it became their stumbling block of iniquity. As for the beauty of his ornaments, he set it in majesty, and they made from it the images of their abominations, their detestable things. Therefore, I have made it like refuse to them. I will give it as plunder into the hands of strangers, and to the wicked of the earth as spoil, and they shall defile it. I will turn my face from them, and they shall defile my secret place, for robbers shall enter it and defile it. In verse 19, the completeness of this coming judgment meant that it would also affect both rich and poor. The wealth of the rich is not going to give them any advantage at all. Their riches got them into trouble, and they could not rescue them from their trouble. So verse 19, translated refuse, refers actually to sexual impurity, such as the ritual uncleanness associated with menstruation. This word refuge belongs to the language of female impurity, and it expresses the revulsion that will be felt not only towards their wealth, but also toward their beautiful ornament that they made, the idols that they had made. They had just decked those out in beautiful things. Money would be thrown away like something sexually unclean. God blessed Israel with wealth and resources. He always has done that. But they used those things to further and promote their idolatry. God even announced that robbers would sack his temple, including the secret place, the Holy of Holies. The coming judgment would be complete, and it would not spare the temple. Verse 23 through 27. Make a chain, for the land is filled with crimes of blood, and the city is full of violence. Therefore, I will bring the worst of the Gentiles, and they will possess their houses. I will cause the pomp of the strong to cease, and their holy places shall be defiled. Destruction comes. They will seek peace, but there shall be no peace. Disaster will come upon disaster, and rumor will be upon rumor. Then they will seek a vision from the prophet, but the law will perish from the priest and counsel from the elders. The king will mourn, the prince will be clothed with desolation, and the hands of the common people will tremble. I will do to them according to their way and according to what they deserve. I will judge them. Then they shall know that I am the Lord. So this was likely a chain that they used to control violent criminals, those guilty of crimes of blood. God would allow great judgment here to punish and restrain his violent, wicked people. So Ezekiel was commanded to perform a symbolic act by making a chain, which was symbolic of the captivity that was following the people, that was waiting them. In Nahum 3:10, it talks about the treatment of prisoners of war here, in this instance consisting of people from the upper class. And that's interesting, I think, here. The chain would have been used to tie the captives together to form a long train of people headed for exile. In verse 24, God made no claim that the invaders would be good or righteous. They were instruments of his severe connection against his people, but they were not good. It says they were the worst of the Gentiles that were going to come against Judah. How he may use a more wickedly population to punish a less wicked one may kind of make our minds go, why did he do that? But it is consistent with his sovereignty over all. And that's by block. In verse 25, there would be no quickly made peace treaty or tribute paid to prevent the disaster. It is going to come. There's nothing that they can do to prevent it anymore. In verse 26, frightened by the disaster and confused by the rumor, some would finally seek a word from the Lord. I mean, when your back is to the wall and there's nothing else you can do, what do people do? They finally turn to the Lord, and that's what they did. In that day of judgment, though, there's not going to be a word from the Lord. The law is going to perish from the priest and the council from the elders. In verse 27, in the eyes of Ezekiel, the king was Jehoiakim, and the prince was Zedekiah. Now, Zedekiah was the last king of Judah, but the prophet did not recognize him as a king, and he considered him only as a prince. So in this scripture also, it says, according to what they deserve, I will judge them. This was a terrible promise. Israel had sinned greatly, so a great judgment is going to come upon them. And then they shall know that I am the Lord. So it's quoted 3 times in this chapter, these words, and it makes us point strongly God's purpose was not Israel's pain. That's not what he wanted. He wanted their restoration to be a true relationship with him. That was his goal. So are there any questions or comments? That's the end of chapter 7. All right, we'll go to part 4, which is actually chapter 8 through 33. And this is Jehovah justifying sending his people into exile. So chapter 8, verse 1. And it came to pass in the 6th year, in the 6th month, on the 5th day of the month, as I sat in my house with the elders of Judah sitting before me, that the hand of the Lord fell upon me there. Now in Ezekiel 1, this began a series of visions beginning in the 5th year of King Jehoiakim's captivity. This is a new time marker describing the visions that happened about 1.5 years after that one in chapter 1. And this series of visions is in Ezekiel 8 through 11. This is a record of one long vision that Ezekiel had. In the beginning of the vision, he sees the glory of the Lord at the temple in Jerusalem. But by the end of the vision, then this glory is going to depart from the temple of God. God will no longer be there. They will supply us with a date corresponding to the 17th of September in 592 BC, so they can pinpoint exactly when this was given. There's something more than a year after Ezekiel had that first vision and his prophetic call. That's what happened in that first vision. And that's by Walter and Hoppe. So this reminds us that Ezekiel had his own house and that he had his own people that recognized him as a prophet, and they would come and they would sit in his house, and he was respected by them. And the reason for their presence in his house is not given, but it's suggested that they came to get a word from the Lord every time that they came. And as before, in Ezekiel 1 and 3, Ezekiel felt the presence and the strength of Yahweh upon him. If you remember in that first vision, he was laying down and he couldn't even get up, and God strengthened him. In verse 2 through 4, in a vision, Ezekiel is transported to Jerusalem. In verse 2, then it says, "Then I looked, and there was a likeness like the appearance of fire, from the appearance of his waist and downward fire. And then from his waist and upward, like the appearance of brightness, like the color of amber. He stretched out the form of a hand and took me by a lock of the hair, and the Spirit lifted me up from earth and heaven, and brought me in visions of God to Jerusalem, to the door of the north gate of the inner court, where the seat of the image of jealousy was, which provokes to jealousy. And behold, the glory of the God of Israel was there, like the vision that I saw in the plain." This vision was the second vision that he had in the plain. In verse 2, Ezekiel saw something similar to the likeness of a man in that vision of God and his glory in that first chapter. And this was a representation of God in some human likeness. And we see the same thing here. In his vision, something like a hand grabbed Ezekiel by the hair, and the Spirit carried him between heaven and earth, bringing him to Jerusalem in a vision. Ezekiel had this spiritual vision of Jerusalem in the days when Jeremiah served as a prophet. So it was way back at that time, in that period between the second invasion of the Babylonians and that last invasion where Judah and Jerusalem were completely captured. That he did not actually leave Babylon is clear from verse 11:24. He was carried back in spirit to Babylon. So he's carried by the Spirit to Jerusalem. Now he's carried back to Babylon after the visions are completed. In this vision, Ezekiel saw 4 abominations at the temple. They were probably not literal in the sense that they were happening all at the same time, that Ezekiel saw them in real time. But God showed Ezekiel what was literally happening in both an outward and in a spiritual sense. So the 4 abominations are this: the outrageous idol associated with the king in verse 5 and 6, the images and censers which were associated with the city leaders, this is 7 through 13, the weeping over Tammuz associated with the women in verse 14 and 15, and the worship of the sun, which was associated with the priests in verses 16 and 18. This is all in this one chapter. So specifically, Ezekiel came to the temple, and as a priest, of course, he had a special interest in the temple and what was going on in that temple. In his vision, he apparently saw an idolatrous image, and it was called the image of jealousy, and it was standing in the inner court. And this was likely right outside the temple building itself. It was called the image of jealousy because it provoked to jealousy. In another place it says it provoked God to jealousy, because it was an insult both to God and to his temple and to his people. Hezekiah, when he was king, removed idolatry from Judah, but his son Manasseh restored it and made it even worse than it was before. and even putting an idol into the temple. And they're talking about this idol. Manasseh's son Ammon continued the state-sponsored idolatry of his father. King Josiah then cleansed Judah of idolatry and burned the idol that Manasseh had put into the temple. And now we see that the idol in the temple was back. So since it had been burned, it was another idol that had been made like the one before. The word image is semel, S-E-M-E-L, which occurs only in Deuteronomy 4:16, where it is translated as a figure, and in 2 Corinthians 33:7 and 15 as a special idol set up by a king. So only in two places is it mentioned other than here. It was set up by King Manasseh in the temple, and although this idol was later removed, Ezekiel's use of the word was meant that it was a replica of it, something that had been put back. So in his image here, in his vision, Ezekiel saw the same glory of God that he had seen in the plain. That was in his second vision. The glory of God was present at the temple of God in Jerusalem. There was a strong contrast here between his glory and the idols and the idolatry that was going on. So Ezekiel's going to see the rest of this vision, God's glory filling the tabernacle, and then later he's going to be gone. So by the end of this vision, the glory of the Lord will no longer dwell in the temple. In verse 5, then he said to me, Son of man, lift your eyes now to the north. So I lifted my eyes toward the north, and there north of the altar gate was this image of jealousy in the entrance. So if one stood facing the temple, they would be facing, the north would be to the right of them. And north of the altar gate was this image of jealousy in the entrance there. And there again, Ezekiel saw the idol in the temple court, and it was called the image of jealousy. The connection of this image with the north gate was significant because it connected this image of jealousy with royalty and the king. This is the gate that was right there by the place where the king dwelt and all of that, and that is the gate that he would come through when he came to worship at the temple. So this was the most honorable of the three gateways because it was the royal palace entrance into the temple, and he used it. In verse 6 through 8, furthermore, he said to me, Son of man, do you see what they are doing? The great abominations that the house of Israel commits here to make me go far away from my sanctuary? Now turn again, you will see greater abominations. So he brought me to the door of the court, and when I looked, there was a hole in the wall. And then he said to me, Son of man, dig into that wall. And I dug into the wall, and there was a door. In verse 6, Ezekiel saw this image of jealousy, and God told him that it represented the great abomination of Israel. And so the idolatry was so persistent and so offensive here to God that it made him determined to go far away from it. It was his sanctuary, it belonged to God himself, and yet he is going to leave it because of their great abominations in that place. So what Ezekiel saw was bad enough, but now God has promised to show him worse things, greater abominations. In verse 8, to see these greater abominations, Ezekiel had to dig a hole in the wall to see in his vision what was inside the temple itself. Now, that's kind of strange because there was a door that went into this area that he could have gone in, and yet God told him to dig a hole in the wall, and there was another door there for him to go into. So this visionary nature of this entire unit removes the necessity of realism. So a vision is not something of reality. in many cases, it is a vision of what God is trying to give to the people. In the spiritual application, it shows it takes a lot of energy sometimes to see what's actually going in. I mean, he had to dig to get to see what that image was. And it was an easy or surface observation. If you just have it really easy, sometimes you miss things. In verse 9 through 12, he said to me, "Go in and see the wicked abominations which they are doing there." Now, this is into the inner court. And so I went in and saw, and there every sort of creeping thing, abominable beast, and all the idols of the house of Israel portrayed all around on the walls. And there stood before them 70 men of the elders of the house of Israel. And in their midst stood Jaazaniah, the son of Saphan. Each man had a censer in his hand, and a thick cloud of incense went up. Then he said to me, "Son of man, have you seen what the elders of the house of Israel do in the dark? Every man in the room of his idols? For they say, 'The Lord does not see us. The Lord has forsaken the land.'" So in verse 9, in this vision, Ezekiel saw the inside of the temple with all sorts of unclean and idolatrous things portrayed all around on the walls. Now we know in that inner place, the interior of the temple walls was all cherubims, and they had put pictures of all these idols and abominations on the walls instead of the cherubims. And it was filthy idols. So God called these wicked abominations the most abominable wickednesses. And these were loathsome in their nature and multiplied in number before me. And that's by Poole. So the consensus of the interpreters here is that they were animal cults that came from Egypt, actually. And in Egypt, you know, they had the highest and most extreme development in the ancient times, in that they worshiped many things. They worshiped oxen, asses, dogs, cats, serpents, crocodiles, the ibis bird, and etc. It goes on and on, all the things that Egypt worshiped. In verse 11, there stood before them the 70 men of the elders of the house of Israel. These are the ones that were supposed to be the head of that. And they were all in front of these foul and idolatrous images were the leaders of Israel, each with a censer that was putting up a smoke in this place, a cloud of incense. So they offered their priestly services and incense associated with prayers to God. They offered that to idolatry and impurity. So they weren't worshiping God at all. They were worshiping all these idols. Elders refers to lay leaders who had risen to prominence in Jerusalem after the deportation of Jehoiakim and his officials. So these were obviously important people, men of the city. Shaphan is probably to be identified with Josiah's Secretary of State, and he was a good man. And Ahikam, another of his sons, was an influential supporter of Jeremiah, if you can remember back to that study. So clearly, Jaazaniah was the black sheep of this family. So God, in verse 12, showed Ezekiel that the vision was about what the leaders of Israel did in the dark and in the room of his idols. It wasn't about what the leaders did in the temple, but it was actually, if you look at it, it was the hidden places in their heart in which they were sinning, and they were filled with dark deeds and idolatry. And yet, what they did is they carried on the surface just like everything was all right. They carried on their service just like everything was fine. And Ezekiel was probably shocked to see that these city leaders were secret idolaters. They didn't know that until he saw that. And they had carried the idolatry of the temple into their private homes also. So public and private worship was permeated with God dishonoring idolatry. And they were just complacent about it all. They thought, well, God can't see us, so it doesn't really matter. And while the external rites of the temple of Jehovah were being observed, these observances that they were doing here was to hide their thoughts, their desires, their heart, and this is the most hopeless state of pollution when it gets down, way down into the heart of a man. So they excused their sin because they didn't think that Yahweh saw them either in their minds or in their actions. And they also excused their sin because they believed that God had forsaken Israel, when in fact it was the opposite. They had forsaken God. So with this kind of rationalization, they permitted themselves to do anything that they desired to do. And if God did not exist, then no one needed to care about him. And it's tragic that that same attitude we see today among so many people. They don't think that God exists, and so everything's okay to do.
The shadow government.
Yes. In verse 13 and 14, and he said to me, turn again, and you will see greater abominations that they are doing. So he brought me to the door of the north gate of the Lord's house, and to my dismay, women were sitting there weeping for Tammuz. Now, in verse 13, Ezekiel saw idolatry outside the temple and corruption among the leaders inside, and yet there were even greater abominations to see, and this is the only mention of Tammuz in Ezekiel in the Old Testament. I didn't know that. But this was also an example of pagan worship, and Tammuz was a deity worshipped by many in the surrounding nations around Israel, and it was immoral and impure. Ezekiel was dismayed because the women were there in the holy place, which was reserved only for priests, and because of their immoral idolatry that they were doing there. So it is likely that the prophet would have viewed the presence of women in the inner court as profanity. Of course it was. And that's also by Balter and Hoppe. So the worship of Tammuz came from Babylon through the Phoenicians or the Canaanites, and then through the Greeks. Tammuz, mentioned nowhere else in the scripture, was the Babylonian god Dumuzi. He was the beloved of Ishtar and is to be identified with the Greek Adonis. And in the seasonal mythological cycle here, he died early in the fall when the vegetation died down, and then he revived by the wailing of Ishtar when the buds of spring came. So he came back alive at that time. And this was also called the fertility of the land, when everything budded back again. So his revival was marked by the buds of spring and the fertility of the land. And this was encouraged and celebrated by licentious fertility festivals that they had.
That we see even today.
Yes, we do. So with the worship of this god in ancient times, it was connected to the basis of immoralities. It was terrible, terrible. And with the greatest abandon, women gave themselves up to most shameful practices. And that's by Feinberg. Verse 15 and 16. Then he said to me, have you seen this, O son of man? Turn again, and you will see greater abominations than these. So he brought me into the inner court of the Lord's house, and there at the door of the temple of the Lord, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men with their backs toward the temple of the Lord, and their faces toward the east, and they were worshiping the sun toward the east. In verse 15, God continually promised Ezekiel that he would see greater and greater abominations. This time, in verse 16, his vision is going to look into the inner court of the temple, and the idolatry of the 70 idols was hidden in the temple, but these men, here, these 25, they practiced their idolatry so that all could see. Where the 70 were hidden, these were so that everybody could see them. About 25 men with their backs toward the temple, from the temple, and they were worshiping the sun in the east. These men stood where the priests would normally stand when they were blessing the people, which they normally did. And they were worshiping the sun. And they did not worship Yahweh even at his own temple. They worshiped the sun as the pagan nations did. So the number and the location of these priests these men indicate that they were probably priests, and that if they were priests, the number was 25 because there was a representation of each of the 24 courses and then the high priest. So that would mean 25 of them. According to 2 Kings in the 2nd chapter, it appears to have gained royal sponsorship during the reign of Manasseh, who built altars for the entire host of heaven in the courts of the temple. And from 2 Kings 23, we see that also they had horses and chariots of the sun at the entrance to the temple. And Josiah demolished those after they had been erected by Manasseh. Verse 17 and 18. And he said to me, have you seen this, O son of man? Is it a trivial thing in the house of Judah to commit the abominations which they commit here? For they have filled the land with violence, for they have returned to provoke me to anger. Indeed, they put the branch to their nose. Therefore I will act in fury. My eye will not spare, nor will I have pity. And though they cry in my ears with a loud voice, I will not hear them. In verse 17, in this vision of the temple, Ezekiel saw all of these horrible variety of idolatries and abominations. The leaders and the people of Jerusalem regarded all as a trivial thing. Oh, this is a trivial thing that we're doing. It doesn't mean anything. But God didn't see it that way. These were not only religious and spiritual sins, they were a rejection of Yahweh himself. And his true worship led to the breakdown of the social order. So the inhabitants of Judah were not content to provoke the Lord with their abominations. They also filled the land with violence and social injustice. So indeed, they put the branch to their nose. So what does this mean? This is an unusual statement. It's the only time it's mentioned here in the Old Testament. And the phrase, the branch to the nose, is obscure. They're not really sure what it meant. So Jewish commentators understand it to refer to something that's revolting and wicked. It was also maybe a ritual act of an idolatrous cult. And then it was grave indeed, but no such ritual is known among the Semitic people, so they're not really sure what it means. Some take it as a gesture of contempt against God. Sticking the branch to the nose may simply describe an insulting physical gesture to express how Yahweh feels about the way his subjects have treated him. The branch held to the nose may have been an imitation of an Egyptian ankh, which was a symbol of life, which is shown in the carvings as held to the nose, just held there. Or it may have been connected with plants that were sacred to Tammuz or some other god. So they would take the plant and they would hold it to their nose so they could smell it. But Walter and Hoppe argue that the text has been corrupted here, they think, and it should read, a branch in my nose. And all that the Lord is saying is that in place of a pleasing odor that came from sacrificial worship, it was not a pleasing odor at all. And what God is receiving from the Israelite was actually called a stench in the nose of God. In verse 18, my eye will not spare, nor will I have pity. So because of the great idolatries and the sins of the people of Jerusalem, and the people regarded it just as a trivial thing, God's judgment is actually going to come. He's going to do it this time. He's tired of it. It cannot be turned back. And because of this corruption of the people, Jehovah will proceed in judgment in spite of all the people crying to him and saying, Lord, have pity upon us, save us, help us, forgive us, all of those kinds of things. He will not let his heart overrule his head in this. So this is the end of chapter 8. Are there any comments or questions on this chapter?
I think it's amazing that God's presence dwelt amongst all of this.
Yes.
His glory was in the temple with all this going on.
Until he was tired of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And some gross abominations of satanic worship.
It's amazing to me that he put up with it this long.
Yeah.
Until it was just so bad that he couldn't take it anymore. But I'm just amazed that he took it this long.
Yes.
Because this had gone on for years and years and years.
And the cherubim to take that wall and put, graffiti or satanic symbolism and idolatry.
Over the cherubim. And
Yeah.
just desecrated the entire temple. Yes.
Do you think it's a good representation of how long he dwells with us, the Holy Spirit, when we're in sin, and how long God dwells with us until we finally surrender?
And how long he will continue to pull people to him in every way that he possibly can. And then many of them still don't come.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a great depiction of the grace of God.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
Very sobering.
Any other comments, questions? All right,
Thinking
next.
about even the festivals, that sounds like Mardi Gras.
Except, yeah.
You know.
And in their festivals, it was a lot of sexual sin that was involved in those things.
Partying
Yes. And I think it's so much like Mardi Gras. It
really is.
It is not a good thing. Mardi Gras is not.
No.
All right, we will start at chapter 11 next week.